As Sarah and Mrs. Benedict rode away in the back of the taxi, they were unaware that the subject of their conversation could still hear every word they were saying from where he stood on the sidewalk with his ear cocked towards the departing vehicle. He had vaguely recognized Sarah's scent, honeysuckle-scented shampoo with some sort of citrus soap, but hadn't been able to place it until he heard the woman's heartbeat take off when she saw his injured face. It was then that he realized where he knew her from, and cursed silently as he realized that she had recognized him, too. Her shaken questions to Mrs. Benedict in the taxi only reinforced that theory. Clutching his cane and trying to tamp down on the rising panic in his chest, Matt pulled out his cell phone to call Foggy. A few hours later, after she was done visiting her father, Sarah found herself hesitating before opening her apartment door and berating herself for it. But she couldn't help imagining Daredevil, or rather, Matt Murdock, hiding in the shadows of her home, waiting to take out the only witness to his identity. For months she had heard the men at work speaking in hushed tones about this man and how dangerous he was. Sarah had no sympathy for most of the men that he put in the hospital. She had seen and heard how cruel they themselves were. But she still cringed at some of the tales of his violence. Snapped arms, broken legs, concussions, extreme blood loss, and even a few comas. Several men had ended up in the hospital using tubes to breathe and eat. The whispered accounts varied on whether or not he had decapitated Antonio Rascrosh, but the general consensus was that no one would put it past him. Sarah knew the vigilante had done a lot of good for the city, rescuing children, saving women, generally doing a lot to fight the bad guys. But no matter how reluctantly she had entered into it, she technically worked for those bad guys. And if he were to find out what she knew, she had no idea if he'd see much difference between her and the hired guns he hospitalized on a regular basis. But there was no way, she reassured herself. He was a good fighter, but he was still blind. He couldn't possibly know that she had been in the office that night, or that she had passed him again outside of her building, and he had acknowledged her as she got into her cab. There was no connection for him to make between her and his activities the night before. Sarah nodded, reassuring herself, unlocking her door and entering the apartment. She'd be too embarrassed to ever admit that she did a quick sweep of her home, under beds, behind the shower curtain, to make sure she was alone before discarding her purse on the table and perching on her computer chair. She opened her laptop nervously, biting her thumbnail and staring at the business card in her hand. Matt Murdock. That was the masked vigilante's name. Before she could talk herself out of it, she brought Google up on her browser and typed the name in. A surprising number of search results came back, most of which were digital copies of newspaper articles dated back 20 years earlier. Boy blinded when toxic truck overturns in Hell's Kitchen. Child saves man from truck crash. Loses sight. Chemical company being investigated for tragic chemical spill. The articles were numerous, but repetitive. The young boy had pushed an old man out of the way of an oncoming truck, but the crash and the resulting chemical spill had blinded him. Down below the articles about the chemical spill, she saw his name mentioned and more links about his father, and clicked on a few. Again, they appeared to be physical newspaper copies scanned online. Battling Jack Murdock, found dead in Hell's Kitchen alley. Hell's Kitchen boxer slain. Murder at Fogwell's gym. Murdock down for the count. An obituary for Jack Murdock from a local Catholic church listed Matthew Murdock as Jack's only child, and made no mention of Matthew's mother or any other possible family. The remaining links were less depressing. An archived Columbia Law webpage from several years ago listing students who were graduating summa cum laude. A few archived law papers of his own on the same website. One naive soul named Chris, who hadn't yet made his Facebook page private, was this not 2015? Had posted a picture of Matthew several years back. The slightly younger-looking man in the picture was in a bar, and had his arms slung around the shoulders of a blond, shaggy-haired man. Both were holding beers and grinning wildly. She scanned the caption, Matthew Murdock and Foggy Nelson, everybody, graduating and leaving the rest of us to wallow in textbooks and law exams. Sarah noted that the Foggy Nelson picture must be Franklin Nelson, accompanying Matthew's name on the business card. Neither of them were tagged, and a quick Facebook search didn't come up with pages for either of them. That was it. Nothing at all to link Matthew Murdock to Daredevil, except for the accident that had blinded him. She assumed that the bandana Daredevil wore over the top half of his face was enough to conceal his identity, but thin enough for him to see through it. But now she realized he didn't need eye holes or sheer material. It wouldn't make any difference if he couldn't see anyway. She recalled how he had moved during the scuffle in Orion, quickly and gracefully, but also brutally, connecting his fists and feet to his opponents with alarming accuracy and no mercy. How could a blind man possibly fight like that? But there was no doubt in her mind, especially now, staring at the Facebook picture on the screen. She could see the shape of his jaw and mouth were undeniably the same, although he looked different with the wide, charming smile he wore in the photo. There was no way it wasn't him, even if it made no sense. I don't want to interrogate a girl, Foggy, especially not one that's about half a foot shorter and 70 pounds lighter than me. Matt and Foggy stood in the reception area of their office, if it could be called that. It had a desk, and at it there was usually a receptionist, although when Matt called Foggy to tell him what was happening, they had made sure to meet up after Karen had already gone home from work. 70 pounds? How does all that martial art muscle weigh, man? Foggy. I know. I don't want to see you running around terrorizing women either, especially since I'm sure if she's in any way connected to your life, she must be a hot one. Matt sighed, ignoring Foggy's claim as usual. Foggy continued. But I mean, what other options do you have here, Matt? She works for the big bad company that you're trying to fight. She's gotta know what kind of company that place is, and she still chooses to work there. And it's especially sketchy that she was looking around the place in the middle of the night. The chick doesn't sound like the most trustworthy person to know your secret. If she tells even one of those guys about who you really are, I know, Foggy. Matt felt sick at the thought of the criminals of Hell's Kitchen finding out his true identity, tracking down Foggy and Karen, probably Claire too, possibly even Father Lorton. I'm not saying I'm not going to interrogate her, I'm just saying I'm not gonna like it. There was a pause. Do you usually like it? Matt didn't answer. Picking up his cane, he turned towards the door. Night was falling, and he had to change into something a little bit more intimidating before tracking down the girl who knew too much. Looking back on it later that night, Sarah realized that her major mistake was procrastinating to take her trash out. She had woken up late that morning, having not slept well the night before for obvious reasons. After sleeping through her first alarm and then additional 20 minutes past that, she got ready for work in a whirlwind, nearly skinning her pinky toe while trying to hurriedly jam her foot into black work pumps, and then having a near miss involving her morning coffee and her white blouse. She had no time to even put on mascara, much less take out the trash. Then after her curbside encounter with Matt Murdock that evening, she had been too busy with her obsessive Googling to think of her increasingly ripe-smelling trash until it was already dark out. Now, in the dim blue light of her computer, she leaned back in her chair and glanced down around her apartment, giving her eyes a break from the screen. Her gaze fell upon her full trash can, and she sighed, uncurling herself from her desk and stretching before walking over the bin and drawing the bag from it. She could do with a normal chore-like task anyway, to take her mind off blind vigilantes and blackmailing crime lords. Once outside in the dark alley behind her apartment, Sarah made her way to the dumpster and threw the trash bag in. It wasn't until he had already invaded her space that she realized she wasn't alone. A large hand covered her mouth while another one settled on her throat, and she stared, wide-eyed in panic, into the partially covered face of Daredevil.